The evening sky turned deep purple as Officer Richard Parker drove slowly through Oak Hill, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in town. His police cruiser's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the large houses with their perfectly trimmed lawns. Richard had been on the force for 12 years, and during that time, he'd developed some troubling views about who belonged where in this town. Richard rolled down his window, feeling the cool autumn air on his face. He didn't like patrolling this neighborhood. The rich folks here always complained about everything, but tonight was quiet. Too quiet, he thought, until he spotted something that made him sit up straight in his seat. A man walking on the sidewalk. The man wore a dark blue suit that probably cost more than Richard made in a month. He walked with confidence, checking his phone occasionally, completely at ease. But Richard couldn't see past one thing: the color of the man's skin. In Oak Hill, where most residents were white, Richard immediately found the presence of a black man suspicious. What's he doing here? Richard muttered to himself, slowing the cruiser, probably casing houses. The man, Anthony Washington, was simply heading back to his car after a dinner meeting with potential investors. At 45 years old, Anthony had worked his way up through law enforcement ranks with dedication and integrity. Recently appointed as the new precinct commander, he was set to start his new position next Monday. Tonight, however, he was just a man trying to get to his car after a long day. Richard pulled his cruiser to the curb and flipped on his lights. He watched as Anthony turned, looking confused. Richard stepped out, hand resting near his weapon, a habit he'd developed over years of letting fear guide his actions. "Evening," Richard called out, his voice harder than necessary. "Mind telling me what you're doing in this neighborhood?" Anthony stopped, surprised by the question, but maintaining his composure. "Good evening, officer. I'm just heading to my car. Had a dinner meeting at the Peterson house back there." He gestured calmly toward a large home down the street. Richard's eyes narrowed. He'd heard excuses before. "I'm going to need to see some ID. May I ask why?" Anthony replied, his voice steady despite his growing concern. "I'm just walking to my car." "Because I said so," Richard snapped, taking a step closer. "This is a private neighborhood. We've had reports of suspicious activity." There had been no such reports, but Richard had used this line before when stopping people who he decided didn't belong. Anthony slowly reached for his wallet, moving with deliberate care. "I understand you're doing your job, officer, but I work in law enforcement myself. I'm actually—" "Sure you are," Richard interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Everyone's got a story. ID now." A couple walking their dog across the street slowed down, watching the interaction with concern. Anthony noticed them and felt a mix of embarrassment and anger rising in his chest. After decades of service to his community, after rising through the ranks, he was still just a suspicious figure to officers like this one. "Here's my driver's license," Anthony said, handing over his ID. "And here's my law enforcement credential as well." Richard barely glanced at the credentials, already convinced of what he would find. "Step away from the sidewalk, stand by my car," he ordered. "Officer, if you would just look at my ID properly." "Now you're resisting?" Richard's voice rose as he grabbed Anthony's arm roughly. "Turn around." "I'm not resisting," Anthony said firmly. "I'm trying to explain." But Richard wasn't listening. He spun Anthony around and pushed him against the police cruiser, pulling his arms behind his back. The handcuffs came out next, clicking tightly around Anthony's wrists. The couple across the street had stopped now. The woman had taken out her phone and was recording. "You're making a serious mistake," Anthony said quietly, maintaining his dignity despite the humiliation of being handcuffed in public. "Please just check my credentials properly." Richard patted Anthony down roughly, finding nothing suspicious. "We'll sort this out at the station," he said, opening the rear door of his cruiser. As Anthony was forced into the back seat, he caught sight of the precinct number on the side of the car. In a twist of fate that would soon become clear, it was the very precinct he was about to command. But Officer Richard Parker had no idea that the man he was treating like a criminal would soon be his boss. The ride to the police station was tense. Anthony sat in silence in the back of the patrol car, the handcuffs digging into his wrists. He took deep breaths, trying to stay calm despite the burning sense of injustice. Through the metal grate separating the front and back seats, he could see Officer Richard Parker's rigid posture, jaw clenched tight as he drove. "Officer, please listen," Anthony tried again. "If you just check my credentials properly." "Save it for the station," Richard snapped, eyes fixed on the road. "I've heard every excuse in the book." Anthony leaned back, looking out the window at the familiar streets passing by. After 23 years in law enforcement, rising through the ranks with an unblemished record, he was being treated like a common criminal. The irony wasn't lost on him that tomorrow he would be reviewing files of officers in the very precinct they were heading to. When they arrived at the station, Richard roughly pulled Anthony from the back seat. Several people in the parking lot stopped to stare, an expensively dressed man in handcuffs being led by an officer who seemed more aggressive than the situation warranted. "Walk," Richard ordered, pushing Anthony toward the entrance. "And don't try anything." "I'm not going to try anything, Officer Parker," Anthony replied quietly. "But you're making a serious mistake." Richard's eyes narrowed at the use of his name, which Anthony had read from his badge. "Just move." As they entered the brightly lit station, a few officers looked up from their desks. The night shift was settling in, coffee cups in hand, paperwork spread out before them. Richard steered Anthony toward the booking area, pride evident in his stance. In his mind, he was doing his job perfectly, keeping the nice neighborhood safe. "Got a trespasser from Oak Hill," Richard announced to the booking officer, a veteran named Officer Thomas Wright. "No ID that matches his story." Thomas looked up, boredom on his face quickly shifting to shock. "What the?" He stood abruptly, eyes wide. "Sir, is that you?" Richard frowned. "You know this guy?" Thomas ignored him, rushing around the desk. "Captain Washington, what happened?" He immediately reached for his keys to unlock the handcuffs. Richard stood frozen, confusion written across his face. "Captain who?" Another officer nearby dropped her coffee mug, which shattered on the floor. "That's Anthony Washington," she whispered loudly enough for Richard to hear. "The new precinct commander." The color drained from Richard's face as realization dawned. He watched helplessly as Thomas carefully removed the handcuffs from Anthony's wrists. "I'm so sorry about this," Captain Thomas said, shooting a furious glance at Richard. "There's clearly been a misunderstanding." Anthony rubbed his wrists, red marks visible where the cuffs had been too tight. He straightened his suit jacket with dignity, his expression controlled despite the situation. "Where's Sergeant Chen?" Anthony asked calmly. "I'll get her right away, sir," Thomas replied, picking up the phone and dialing quickly. Richard stood rooted to the spot, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The other officers in the room were staring at him with a mixture of shock and disgust. News traveled fast in a police station. Within minutes, everyone would know what he had done. Sergeant Chen appeared from her office, her usual composed demeanor replaced with obvious concern. "Captain Washington," she said, approaching quickly. "I just heard. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Sergeant," Anthony replied, though the tension in his shoulders told a different story. "Though I would appreciate a private space to make a phone call." "Of course. Please use my office," she offered, then turned to Richard with fire in her eyes. "Officer Parker, my office," immediately after. As Anthony was escorted to the surgeon's office, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It had been returned along with his wallet and credentials. A text notification showed that the video of his arrest was already circulating online. Someone had recorded the entire incident. Richard watched his new boss walk away, the weight of what he'd done sinking in. Not only had he wrongfully arrested an innocent man based on nothing but the color of his skin, but that man was about to become his direct superior. And now, the evidence of his actions was spreading across social media for the world to see. His career, which he'd built over 12 years, might be over in 12 hours. Officer Thomas leaned close as he passed by. "You really did it this time, Parker," he whispered. "That man starts as our commander on Monday." In Sergeant Chen's office, Anthony loosened his tie and took a deep breath. His hands were still shaking slightly, not from fear, but from anger and disappointment. 23 years in law enforcement, and he was still judged by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. "Water, sir," Sergeant Chen offered, placing a glass on the desk. "Thank you," Anthony replied, taking a sip. "Has Chief Rivera been notified?" "Yes, he's on his way. Should be here in 10 minutes. Chen said, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and concern. "Captain, I want to personally apologize for Officer Parker's behavior. That's not who we are as a precinct." Anthony nodded thoughtfully. "Isn't it, though?" he asked quietly. "One officer acted, but how many stood by in the past? How many times has this happened when the person wasn't about to become the precinct commander?" Chen looked down, unable to answer. They both knew the truth. Meanwhile, in the main office area, Richard sat at his desk, head in his hands. His partner, Officer Garza, approached cautiously. "Man, you really stepped in it this time," Garza whispered. "What were you thinking?" "How was I supposed to know?" Richard hissed back defensively. "Know what? That he was the new captain, or that he was innocent?" Garza shot back. "Because neither should matter, Park. You can't just stop people because they look out of place in a neighborhood." Before Richard could respond, the station doors burst open. Chief Rivera strode in, his face tight with barely contained fury. Officers scattered from his path like leaves in a storm. He walked straight past Richard without a glance, heading directly for Chen's office. Richard watched through the glass as the chief shook Anthony's hand, his body language apologetic. They talked for several minutes, with Anthony occasionally gesturing as he explained what had happened. Chief Rivera's expression grew darker with each passing moment. Richard's phone buzzed. It was his wife. "Call me now. There's a video of you all over Facebook. What did you do?" His stomach dropped. The couple across the street must have uploaded their recording. He tried to imagine how it looked from the outside, him aggressively handcuffing a well-dressed man who had done nothing wrong. There would be no hiding from this. The door to Chen's office opened, and Chief Rivera emerged, followed by Anthony and Sergeant Chen. "Parker," the chief barked. "My office. Now." As Richard stood shakily, Anthony held up a hand. "If you don't mind, Chief, I'd like to be present for this discussion." The chief nodded grimly. "Of course, Captain." The walk to the chief's office felt like a death march to Richard. Officers watched in silence, some with pity, others with something harder in their eyes. He had crossed a line tonight, and everyone knew it. Inside the chief's office, Richard stood at attention, sweat beading on his forehead as the chief paced behind his desk. "Officer Parker," Chief Rivera began, his voice dangerously calm. "Do you understand what you've done tonight?" "Sir, I was just following protocol for suspicious." "Suspicious what?" Anthony interrupted, leaning forward in his chair. "A man walking to his car after a meeting. Tell me, officer, what exactly was suspicious about me?" Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't dig his hole deeper. Chief Rivera slid a tablet across the desk. On it played the video from social media, showing Richard forcing Anthony against the car, roughly handcuffing him while Anthony calmly tried to explain himself. "The department's phone has been ringing nonstop for the past 20 minutes, Chief Rivera said. "The mayor called. The press is asking for a statement." He pointed to the tablet. "This doesn't look like protocol to me, Parker. This looks like harassment." Richard's future flashed before his eyes, not just his career, but his reputation, his family's stability. "Captain Washington will be taking command of this precinct on Monday," Chief Rivera continued. "Right now, he would be within his rights to demand your badge." Richard glanced at Anthony, expecting to see triumph or vengeance in his eyes. Instead, he saw something unexpected: calculation, assessment, and perhaps a hint of something Richard couldn't quite identify. However, Anthony said carefully, "I believe this situation presents an opportunity, Chief. An opportunity that goes beyond one officer's mistake." Both Richard and the chief looked at Anthony in surprise. "With your permission," Anthony continued, "I'd like to handle this matter personally once I take command." He turned to look directly at Richard. "Officer Parker and I have much to discuss about policing, community, and justice. This conversation is just beginning." The next morning, Richard sat at his kitchen table staring at his phone. The video had gone viral overnight, 3 million views and climbing. News outlets had picked up the story. Police officer unknowingly arrests his new boss. Comments flooded in, most calling for his badge, some worse. His wife Diane moved around the kitchen quietly, the tension between them thick as fog. She hadn't said much since he explained what happened, just shook her head and asked, "What were you thinking, Rich?" The truth was, he hadn't been thinking. He'd been reacting based on assumptions he'd never really examined. His phone rang. Sergeant Chen. Parker, you're on administrative leave pending investigation. Turn in your badge and gun by noon. Yes, ma'am, he replied, his voice hollow. After hanging up, he looked at Diane. I might lose everything. She sat across from him, eyes tight but clear. You need to ask yourself why this happened, Rich. Really ask yourself. Meanwhile, across town, Anthony was dealing with his own storm. His phone had been ringing since dawn. Reporters, community leaders, old friends checking in. The video had made him an overnight symbol, something he never wanted to be. He sat in his home office preparing for his first day as precinct commander on Monday. It wouldn't be the fresh start he'd hoped for. The incident had created a spotlight that would follow him into the role. His doorbell rang. It was Robert Taylor, an old friend and community activist. I saw the video, Robert said as he stepped inside. You okay? Anthony nodded. I'm fine. Angry, but fine. So what happens to this officer? Please tell me he's done. Anthony gestured for Robert to sit. It's more complicated than that. Complicated? Robert's voice rose. He profiled you, manhandled you, humiliated you, and he did it because you're black. What's complicated about that? Anthony was quiet for a moment. What happens if I demand his badge? He's fired. Maybe he gets another job in another department where no one knows what happened. Nothing changes. So he gets away with it. No, Anthony said firmly. He'll be held accountable. But I'm thinking bigger than one officer, Rob. This precinct has problems that go beyond Richard Parker. Back at the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers spoke in hushed tones, glancing at Richard as he cleaned out his locker. Some avoided eye contact entirely. His partner Garza approached as he was finishing. This is messed up, man, Garza said. Yeah, well, I messed up, Richard replied, surprising himself with the admission. What did the captain say to you? After the chief left? Richard zipped his bag closed. Nothing yet. But he wants to meet with me Monday. Good luck with that, Garza said, shaking his head. As Richard walked through the station toward the exit, carrying his personal belongings in a box, he felt the weight of every stare. This place had been his second home for 12 years. Now he might never wear the uniform again. Outside, a small group of protesters had gathered, holding signs demanding accountability. Richard ducked his head and hurried to his car, but not before someone recognized him. That's him, a voice called out. Richard quickened his pace as shouts followed him. Once in his car, he sat gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white, as the protesters surrounded his vehicle, chanting and filming with their phones. This was his new reality. Across town, Anthony was in the chief's office, reviewing Richard's personnel file. There was a pattern there, not enough for termination before, but enough to raise red flags. Multiple complaints from minority citizens, each dismissed or explained away. Poor marks in community relations, but also commendations for bravery for solving difficult cases. He's not a cartoon villain, Anthony remarked to the chief. He's more dangerous than that. He's an average officer who never questioned his own biases. So what's your plan? Asked Chief Rivera. Anthony closed the file. Monday morning, when I take command, I want to address the entire precinct, and I want Officer Parker present. You sure that's wise? The media will be all over this. I'm counting on it, Anthony replied. What happened to me happens to people in our community every day. The only difference is I had the authority to make it stop. Most people don't. The chief studied Anthony carefully. This isn't just about Parker for you, is it? No, Anthony admitted. It's about changing a culture. And sometimes, to change a culture, you need a moment that no one can ignore. He tapped Richard's file. This officer and I, we're going to create that moment together. Monday morning arrived with a buzz of tension at the precinct. Officers filed into the main conference room, murmuring among themselves. News vans lined the street outside, reporters checking equipment and practicing their opening lines. At home, Richard adjusted his tie for the third time. He wasn't in uniform. He was suspended after all. But he wanted to look presentable, professional. Maybe it would help, though he doubted it. You don't have to go, Diane said from the doorway. Yes, I do. Richard turned to face her. Captain Washington specifically asked for me to be there, and honestly, I owe him that much. The drive to the station was the longest 20 minutes of Richard's life. Every traffic light seemed to last forever, giving him too much time to think about what awaited him. Would he be publicly fired? Made an example of? His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. When he arrived, Officer Thomas met him at the side entrance. "Everyone's inside already," Thomas said coolly. "The captain wants you to wait in his office until he calls for you." Richard nodded, following Thomas through the hallways. Officers stopped talking as he passed. He kept his eyes forward, ignoring their stares, though he could feel the weight of their judgment. In what was now Captain Washington's office, Richard sat alone, staring at the wall. Family photos had been placed on the desk. Anthony with an older woman who must be his mother, Anthony at a community event. Normal, everyday pictures that somehow made Richard feel even worse. He'd reduced this complex human being to nothing but the color of his skin. Meanwhile, in the conference room, Anthony stood at the podium, surveying the room filled with officers and department staff. Camera crews had been allowed in the back, their lenses focused on him. "Good morning," he began. "Not exactly how I planned to introduce myself as your new commander." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. "By now, everyone has seen the video of my arrest Thursday night. What many of you don't know is that this wasn't my first experience with being profiled. It wasn't even my 10th. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. "The first time I was stopped for looking suspicious was when I was 14 years old, walking home from basketball practice. The most recent time was Thursday night. That's 31 years of the same experience." Anthony pulled up footage from Richard's body camera on the screen behind him, showing the moment of the arrest from Richard's perspective. "I want to talk about what happens in this video," Anthony continued. "Not to punish one officer, but because this moment, this interaction, represents something larger that we need to address." He played the footage, stopping at key moments to point out assumptions being made, opportunities missed, escalation where de-escalation was possible. "This isn't about political correctness," Anthony explained. "It's about effective policing. Officer Parker didn't recognize potential evidence that might have changed his approach, my demeanor, my explanation, my credentials. He saw one thing, the color of my skin, in what he considered the wrong neighborhood, and filtered everything else through that lens." In the office, Richard could hear Anthony's voice through the door. Each word felt like a weight on his chest. The analysis was clinical, precise, and completely accurate. A knock at the door startled him. Sergeant Chen entered. "He's ready for you now," she said simply. Richard stood, smoothing his tie one last time. "Am I being fired?" Chen's expression gave nothing away. "That's for the captain to discuss with you." Walking into the conference room felt like walking to his own execution. All eyes turned to him, colleagues, superiors, media. At the podium, Anthony paused as Richard entered. Officer Parker. Thank you for joining us. Please have a seat in the front." The room was silent as Captain Washington walked down from the podium and stood directly in front of Richard. Camera shutters clicked rapidly in the background, capturing what everyone knew would be tomorrow's headline. "Officer Parker," Anthony said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I'm offering you a choice. The first option is resignation, effective immediately. Clean break, no further investigation." Richard swallowed hard. That was the easy way out, the path many in his position would take. "The second option," Anthony continued, "is considerably harder. You remain suspended without pay for 1 month. During that time, you complete an intensive program I've designed specifically for you." Whispers spread through the room. This wasn't what anyone had expected. "What kind of program?" Richard asked, finding his voice at last. 4 weeks. The first week, you'll ride along with community leaders in neighborhoods you've patrolled but never truly known. You'll listen to their experiences with law enforcement, good and bad. Anthony began to pace slowly in front of him. Week 2, you'll work with our data analyst reviewing your own stop records compared to other officers. You'll identify patterns in your own behavior. The journalists were scribbling frantically now, their cameramen zooming in on Richard's face. Week 3, you'll assist in teaching at the academy, not as an instructor, but as a case study. You'll break down your body camera footage for new recruits, explaining each mistake, each assumption. Richard felt his face burning with shame, but he held Anthony's gaze. "And week 4, Anthony said, you'll work with me. Directly. We'll develop new training protocols for this precinct based on what you've learned. A buzz ran through the room. The chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat. After that, Anthony continued, if I'm satisfied with your progress, you return to duty with 6 months probation, regular reviews, and a permanent note in your file. One more incident like this, and you're done. No third chances. He stepped even closer to Richard. The choice is yours. Resignation or rehabilitation, but I need your answer now. Richard looked around the room at his fellow officers, at the cameras, at Sergeant Chen, whose expression remained unreadable. Then back at Anthony, the man he humiliated, whose career he could have damaged, whose dignity he'd assaulted. Why would you give me a second chance? Richard asked quietly. I'm not, Anthony replied. I'm giving this department a second chance. I'm giving myself a chance to create actual change instead of just another headline. The question is, are you willing to be part of that change, even if it means walking through fire to get there? The room held its breath. Richard straightened in his chair. I'll take the program, sir. Anthony nodded once. Dismissed. Report to my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. As Richard stood to leave, Anthony addressed the room again. Let me be clear to everyone here. This isn't leniency. What I'm asking of Officer Parker is harder than firing him. I'm asking him to confront his biases publicly to help us build something better from this mistake. I expect everyone in this precinct to support this process, not for his sake, but for the community we serve. After the meeting, Anthony retreated to his new office, closing the door behind him. He sank into his chair, suddenly exhausted. His phone buzzed. Robert. I just saw the press conference. Are you serious? That cop deserved to be fired. Maybe, Anthony agreed. But then what? Another officer with the same biases takes his place? The system stays exactly the same. You're taking a big risk, Robert warned. If he screws up again, that's on you. I know. But if he actually changes, if we use this to change the culture here, that's worth the risk. After hanging up, Anthony stared at his reflection in the computer screen. He'd just put his reputation on the line for a man who had disrespected him, humiliated him. Was he being naive? There was a knock at his door. It was Officer Garza, Richard's partner. Got a minute, Captain? Anthony gestured for him to enter. What's on your mind, officer? Garza closed the door and stood awkwardly. What you're doing with Parker, some of us have been talking. We think it's, he searched for the right word, important. Important enough for you to participate, because I'll need help from officers he respects. Garza nodded slowly. I've been his partner for 3 years. There are good parts of him worth saving. And maybe there are things I should have called him on before now. For the first time that day, Anthony felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this painful incident could become something transformative after all. Have a seat, Officer Garza, Anthony said. I think we have a lot to discuss. 6 months later, the community center buzzed with activity. Tables lined the walls, each staffed by officers chatting with neighborhood residents over coffee and donuts. Children played basketball with uniformed cops in the corner, their laughter echoing through the gymnasium. Anthony stood near the entrance, watching with quiet satisfaction. The community outreach program had been his idea, but the officers had embraced it with unexpected enthusiasm, especially Richard. Speaking of whom, Anthony spotted Richard deep in conversation with Mr. Wilson, an elder from the neighborhood who had been one of Richard's harshest critics during those first difficult weeks. Now they were laughing together, the tension between them long dissolved. Quite a change from 6 months ago, Sergeant Chen said, appearing at Anthony's side. It's a start, Anthony replied cautiously. We still have a long way to go. The precinct had undergone remarkable transformation in half a year. Complaint rates were down 40%. Officer satisfaction scores had improved. The required body camera reviews Anthony had implemented had revealed problems with other officers too, but instead of punishment, they'd followed Richard's path: education, community immersion, and accountability. Richard noticed Anthony watching and excused himself from Mr. Wilson. Captain, he said, approaching them. Mr. Wilson just told me his grandson got accepted to the police academy. That's great news, Anthony replied. He said our work here convinced him that change is possible from the inside. Richard's voice held wonder and humility. Never thought I'd be part of something like that. Anthony studied the man before him. Richard's transformation hadn't been instant or easy. That first week of community listening sessions had been brutal. Richard had heard cruel truths about how his actions had affected people. The data review had been equally difficult, forcing him to confront patterns he'd long denied. Teaching at the academy had perhaps been hardest of all, standing before fresh-faced recruits, explaining how his biases had nearly destroyed his career and hurt innocent people. But he'd stuck with it, even when other officers mocked him, even when protesters continued to call for his badge, even when his own family questioned whether it was worth it. "The newspaper wants an interview with us," Anthony said. "The 6-month follow-up on our experiment, as they're calling it." Richard grimaced. "Do we have to?" "I think it's important," Anthony replied. "People need to see that accountability doesn't have to mean punishment without growth. They need to see that change is possible." Later that evening, after the community event wrapped up, Anthony found Richard in the parking lot. "Got a minute?" Anthony asked. Richard nodded, leaning against his car. 6 months ago, if someone had told you we'd be standing here like this, not as enemies or even as boss and employee, but as something closer to friends, what would you have said?" Anthony asked. Richard laughed softly. "I'd have said they were crazy. The night I arrested you was the worst night of my career. When I realized who you were," he shook his head. "I was sure I was done." "You almost were," Anthony admitted. "I came very close to demanding your badge." "Why didn't you?" Anthony was quiet for a moment. "Because I've seen too many officers fired only to be hired somewhere else, carrying the same biases to a new community. The cycle never ends." He looked at Richard directly. "I wanted to try breaking the cycle." "Do you think we have?" Richard asked quietly. "In this precinct, we've made a dent." "In you?" Anthony smiled slightly. "I think so." Richard stared at the ground. "My daughter asked me yesterday why I've been different lately. More, I don't know, at peace maybe. I told her I finally started seeing people, really seeing them, instead of just looking for problems." "That's a good start," Anthony said. "It's because of you," Richard said, meeting Anthony's eyes. "You could have destroyed me, and no one would have blamed you. Instead, you forced me to face myself. I don't think I can ever fully repay that." "You don't have to repay me," Anthony replied. "Just pay it forward. Train the next generation of officers. Speak up when you see what you used to be in others. That's how real change happens." As they said goodnight and Anthony watched Richard drive away, he thought about that terrible night 6 months ago. The humiliation, the anger, the sense of helplessness despite his rank and position. For a moment, he had been reduced to nothing but the color of his skin. Yet from that moment, something unexpected had grown. Not forgiveness exactly, that was too simple a word. Understanding, perhaps. A bridge where there had been a wall. His phone buzzed, a text from Chief Rivera. "Press loves the Community Day photos. Mena wants to expand program citywide." Anthony smiled as he got into his car. One arrest. One mistake. One choice to do something different. Sometimes that's all it takes to begin changing a system that has stood unchallenged for too long.